I don't know why I ever thought hitchhiking was a good idea. Desperation does strange things to people, I guess. It was 1987, and I was a broke college kid trying to get home for Thanksgiving. My car had broken down 2 days earlier, and my last paycheck had been spent on textbooks. So, with no other options and a stubborn need to get home, I found myself standing on the side of Highway 77 with my thumb out. I'll never forget the car that stopped. It was an old, beat-up blue station wagon, the kind that looked like it had seen better decades. The driver was a middle-aged man, probably in his late 40s, with a receding hairline and a friendly smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He rolled down the passenger window and said, "Where you headed?" "Lincoln," I replied, gripping the straps of my backpack tightly. "Hop in," he said, unlocking the passenger door. "I'm headed that way." I hesitated. Something about him didn't sit right with me, but I brushed it off as nerves. I had been standing out there for nearly an hour, and the sun was starting to set. Against my better judgment, I got in. The inside of the car smelled faintly of old leather and something metallic. There was a half-empty bottle of water in the cup holder and a pile of fast food wrappers on the floor. As soon as I closed the door, I felt the lock engage with a heavy click. "Thanks," I said, trying to sound casual. "No problem," he replied, glancing at me out of the corner of his eye. "What's your name?" I lied and gave him a fake name. Something about the way he asked made my skin crawl. For the first 10 minutes, we made small talk. He asked about my family, where I went to school, and if I had a boyfriend. His questions felt invasive, but I tried to keep the conversation light. I didn't want to offend him. I'd read too many stories about hitchhiking gone wrong. Then, out of nowhere, he said, "You know, you really shouldn't hitchhike. You never know what kind of people might pick you up." I laughed nervously. "Yeah, I guess you're right." He didn't laugh. Instead, he gripped the steering wheel tighter, his knuckles turning white. "There are some real monsters out there," he said, almost to himself. The air in the car grew heavy. I glanced at the door handle, wondering if I could unlock it and jump out if I needed to. But we were speeding down the highway now, and the thought of tumbling onto the asphalt wasn't exactly appealing. Then he said something that sent a chill down my spine. "Do you believe in fate?" I swallowed hard. "I don't know. Why?" He smiled, and this time it wasn't friendly. It was cold and calculating. "Because I think people meet for a reason, like you and me right now. It feels meant to be." My heart started to race. I forced a laugh. "Yeah, sure. Thanks again for the ride." He didn't respond. Instead, he reached over and turned up the radio. Static filled the car before he tuned it to a station playing old rock songs. For the next few miles, he didn't say much, but every so often I'd catch him glancing at me, his eyes lingering just a little too long. My hands were clammy, and I couldn't stop fidgeting with the zipper on my jacket. Then, without warning, he veered off the highway onto an unmarked dirt road. "Hey," I said, my voice shaking, "this doesn't look like the way to Lincoln." "It's a shortcut," he said flatly. Panic started to set in. "I think I'd rather stay on the highway if that's okay." He didn't answer. Instead, he pressed harder on the gas pedal, the car bouncing over the uneven road. I knew I had to do something. My eyes darted around the car, looking for anything I could use as a weapon. There was nothing. Just a pile of garbage and an empty glove compartment. "Stop the car," I said, my voice firmer this time. He didn't even look at me. "Stop the car," I screamed. Finally, he turned to me, his expression unreadable. "Why? Don't you trust me?" "No," I said, my voice cracking. "I want out, now." He let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. Too late for that. At that moment, I knew I was in real danger. My heart was pounding so loudly I could barely hear the music anymore. Without thinking, I grabbed the door handle and yanked on it as hard as I could. It didn't budge. "You're wasting your energy," he said calmly. "Child locks." I felt tears prick the corners of my eyes. I couldn't let him see me cry. The road ended in front of a dilapidated cabin surrounded by dense woods. He stopped the car and turned to me with that same unnerving smile. "Home sweet home," he said. Before I could react, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a knife. "Don't scream," he said. "It'll only make things worse." I froze, my mind racing. Then, out of nowhere, I remembered the bottle of water in the cup holder. With one swift motion, I grabbed it and smashed it against his temple. He screamed in pain, dropping the knife. I didn't wait to see what he'd do next. I unlocked the door, scrambled out, and ran as fast as I could into the woods. Branches tore at my clothes and skin, but I didn't care. All I could think about was putting as much distance as possible between me and that cabin. I don't know how long I ran, but eventually I stumbled onto another road. A passing car stopped when they saw me, and the driver, a kind, older woman, called the police. When they went back to the cabin, it was empty. No sign of the man, no sign of the car. But what they did find still haunts me. In the basement, there were chains bolted to the walls, bloodstains on the floor, and photographs of other young people who had never been found. The police told me I was lucky to be alive. But even now, all these years later, I can't shake the feeling that he's still out there, looking for his next victim.
Story number 2.
I was 21 when it happened. I'd just finished a shift at the diner where I worked and was on my way to visit my boyfriend in the next town over. It was late, close to midnight, and the old sedan I drove had been acting up all week. Sure enough, halfway there it broke down in the middle of nowhere. I remember standing by the side of the road, under the dim light of the crescent moon, my breath fogging in the chilly air. The highway was silent, stretching endlessly into the darkness. My cell phone was dead, of course, because this was the early 2000s, and I wasn't great at remembering to charge it. I was stranded, and my only option was to hitch a ride. I'd heard the warnings. My mom drilled them into my head every time I mentioned hitchhiking. You don't know who you're getting into a car with. But I figured most people were decent. Besides, I didn't have much of a choice. The first car that passed didn't even slow down. Neither did the second. But the third, a battered black pickup truck, pulled over about 10 feet ahead of me. The driver leaned over and pushed open the passenger door. "Need a lift?" he called out. I hesitated. The man was older, maybe late 50s, with a scruffy beard and deep-set eyes that glinted in the dim light. He didn't look friendly, but he didn't look dangerous either. "Yeah," I said, clutching my bag. "My car broke down." "Lucky for you, I'm headed your way," he said. "Hop in." Against my better judgment, I climbed into the truck. The inside smelled faintly of oil and cigarettes. The dashboard was covered in loose papers, and there was an empty coffee cup in the cup holder. "Where are you headed?" he asked, pulling back onto the highway. "Just to Millfield," I said. He nodded, his gaze fixed on the road. For the first few minutes, the ride was quiet. Then he started talking. "Bad night to be out here alone?" he said, his voice gravelly. "Yeah," I replied, keeping my answers short. "Not a lot of people on this road at night," he continued. "Could be dangerous for a girl like you." I didn't like the way he said it. There was something off about his tone, something that made my skin crawl. "I'm fine," I said quickly. "Thanks for stopping." He smiled, but it wasn't a kind smile. It was the kind that showed too many teeth, like a wolf baring its fangs. "You know," he said, glancing at me, "yeah, I've picked up a lot of hitchhikers over the years. Not all of them make it to where they're going." My stomach dropped. "What do you mean?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached over and turned on the radio. Static filled the truck before he landed on a station playing an old country song. "Some folks just disappear," he said finally, his voice almost drowned out by the music. "People don't realize how easy it is to vanish out here." I stared at him, my heart pounding. "What are you talking about?" He looked at me, his eyes cold and unblinking. "You ever hear about the highway hunter?" I froze. Everyone in the area had heard of the highway hunter, a serial killer who'd been active in the region for years. He was infamous for picking up hitchhikers, only for their bodies to be found weeks later in remote, wooded areas. "Yeah," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I've heard of him." The man smiled again, that same unsettling grin. "They say he's still out there, you know, driving these same roads looking for his next victim." I forced a laugh, trying to mask my fear. "Well, I guess I'm lucky you're not him, huh?" He didn't laugh. The rest of the ride was tense. He kept glancing at me, his gaze lingering too long. My hands were clammy, and I couldn't stop fidgeting with the zipper on my jacket. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. "I think I'll get out here," I said, pointing to a gas station up ahead. He slowed down but didn't stop. "I'll take you a little further," he said. "Gas station's no place to be alone at night." "No, really," I insisted. "I'll be fine." His grip tightened on the steering wheel. I said, "I'll take you further." My chest tightened as panic set in. I reached for the door handle, but it didn't budge. "Child locks," he said, his voice low and menacing. "Can't have my passengers running off now, can I?" My heart was racing. I looked around the truck, searching for anything I could use as a weapon. My eyes landed on the coffee cup in the cup holder. It wasn't much, but it was all I had. He was talking again, but I couldn't focus on his words. All I could think about was getting out of that truck. "People like you," he was saying, "don't realize how easy it is to end up in the wrong place at the wrong time." I grabbed the coffee cup and swung it at his head with all my strength. The cup shattered, spilling cold coffee everywhere. He screamed, momentarily losing control of the truck. I used the distraction to reach for the door again, this time slamming my shoulder into it. The lock finally gave way, and I tumbled out onto the asphalt. I rolled onto my hands and knees, ignoring the pain, and scrambled to my feet. The truck had stopped, and I could see him climbing out, cursing loudly. I didn't wait to see what he would do next. I ran as fast as I could, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The highway was dark and empty, but I didn't stop. I didn't dare look back. Eventually, I saw headlights approaching. I ran into the middle of the road, waving my arms frantically. The car slowed to a stop, and the driver, a middle-aged woman, rolled down her window. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice filled with concern. "No," I gasped. "Please, you have to help me." She unlocked the door and I climbed in, trembling. As we drove away, I glanced back at the highway. The black pickup truck was gone. I reported the incident to the police, but they never found the man. To this day, I don't know if he was the highway hunter or just some creep trying to scare me. But I do know one thing. I'll never hitchhike again.
Story number 3.
It was the summer of 1994 when I found myself hitchhiking through rural Montana. I was young, broke, and naive enough to believe I was invincible. I had just finished a road trip with some friends who had gone their separate ways, leaving me to figure out how to get back to Oregon. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, painting the sky with streaks of orange and pink, when an old green sedan pulled over. The driver was a woman, maybe in her late 30s, with short blonde hair and a tired smile. "Need a ride?" she asked, leaning over to unlock the passenger door. Relieved, I nodded. "Yeah, thanks. Just trying to get as far west as possible." She gestured for me to get in, and I climbed into the car, setting my backpack on the floor. The inside was clean, except for a few crumpled receipts and a pair of sunglasses on the dashboard. "I'm headed to Butte," she said, glancing at me as she pulled back onto the road. "That work for you?" "Perfect," I replied. "Thanks again. I wasn't sure how much longer I'd be waiting." She smiled faintly but didn't say anything else. For a while, the ride was quiet except for the hum of the engine and the faint country music playing on the radio. I tried to relax, but something about the silence felt off. After about 10 minutes, she spoke again. "You shouldn't be out here alone," she said, her tone flat. "I know," I admitted, trying to lighten the mood. But I didn't have much of a choice. She glanced at me briefly, her expression unreadable. "People disappear out here, you know." My stomach tightened. "Disappear?" She nodded, keeping her eyes on the road. "A lot of hitchhikers go missing, especially young ones like you." I forced a laugh, trying to shake off the sudden unease. "Well, I guess I'm lucky you're not a serial killer." She didn't laugh. The silence stretched on, growing heavier with every passing mile. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Her grip on the steering wheel was too tight, her eyes darting to the rearview mirror every few seconds. "You okay?" I asked hesitantly. She didn't answer right away. Then, finally, she said, "Do you believe in spirits?" I blinked, caught off guard. "Spirits?" She nodded. "Ghosts. Restless souls, the ones that can't move on." "I guess," I said, unsure of where this was going. "Why?" She took a deep breath, her knuckles whitening as she gripped the wheel even tighter. "There's something you need to know about this road." I frowned, my pulse quickening. "What do you mean?" She glanced at me again, her eyes dark and serious. "This stretch of highway, it's cursed. People die out here, and their spirits don't leave. They linger, looking for someone to take their place." A nervous laugh escaped my lips. "Are you messing with me?" Her expression didn't change. "I wish I was." The air in the car seemed to grow colder. I glanced out the window, but the landscape was empty, just endless stretches of road and the occasional silhouette of trees. "You're scaring me," I admitted. She didn't respond. Instead, she slowed the car and pulled over onto the shoulder. "What are you doing?" I asked, my voice rising. She turned off the engine and stared straight ahead. "I need to tell you something," she said quietly. My heart was pounding now. "What?" She looked at me, her face pale and strained. "You're not the first hitchhiker I've picked up on this road, but you might be the last." A chill ran down my spine. "What are you talking about?" Her gaze dropped to her hands, which were trembling slightly. "A few years ago, I picked up a man out here. He was standing right where you were, said he needed a ride to Butte." I didn't say anything, my throat too dry to speak. "He seemed normal at first," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "But as we drove, he started acting strange. He kept looking over his shoulder like someone was following us, And then he said something I'll never forget. What did he say? I finally managed to ask. Her eyes met mine, and I could see the fear in them. He told me I shouldn't have stopped, that they were going to come for me now. I swallowed hard. Who? The spirits, she said, her voice trembling. The ones that haunt this road. He said they take people who stop. That's how they escape. They find someone to replace them. I stared at her, my pulse thundering in my ears. What happened to him? She looked away, her jaw tightening. He disappeared. 1 minute he was sitting right where you are, and the next he was gone. Just gone. I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. That's impossible. I thought so too, she said. But then it started happening. Every time I drive this road, I see someone standing there, always in the same spot, always looking for a ride. My stomach churned. You think I'm one of them? She didn't answer. Instead, she reached into her glove compartment and pulled out a folded piece of paper. She handed it to me without a word. I unfolded it, my hands shaking. It was a newspaper clipping. The headline read, "Mysterious Disappearances Plague Montana Highway." Underneath the headline was a photo. My breath caught in my throat. It was me, or at least it looked like me. Same face, same clothes, same backpack. But the date on the article was from 3 years earlier. This isn't real, I said, my voice barely audible. This can't be real. I thought the same thing, she said, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. But it is. I shook my head, my mind racing. This is some kind of joke. It has to be. She reached for the keys, her hands still trembling. I'll take you to Butte, she said, starting the engine. But after that, I can't do this anymore. I can't keep picking them up. I wanted to argue, to demand an explanation, but the words wouldn't come. The rest of the ride was silent, the tension in the car almost unbearable. When we reached the edge of Butte, she pulled over and unlocked the doors. This is as far as I go, she said, avoiding my gaze. I climbed out, my legs shaky. As I closed the door, she leaned out the window. Don't stay on this road too long, she said, and whatever you do, don't look back. Before I could respond, she drove off, her taillights disappearing into the darkness. I stood there for a moment trying to process what had just happened. Then slowly I turned to look back at the highway. I shouldn't have. In the distance, I saw a figure standing on the side of the road. A hitchhiker, just like me. Only this time, it wasn't me.
Story number 4.
It was the summer after my freshman year of college, and I was desperate to escape the monotony of my tiny hometown. My plan was simple. Hitchhike to the coast, find odd jobs, and figure it out from there. My mom hated the idea, warning me that bad things happen to girls on the road, but I brushed it off. I was young, adventurous, and completely convinced that nothing bad could ever happen to me. I started the journey early in the morning, the air still cool with the lingering chill of night. Most of the day went smoothly, rides were frequent, and the people who picked me up were friendly enough. By dusk, I'd made it about halfway to the coast, with just a stretch of empty highway standing between me and my destination. The trouble began as the sun started to set. The last car that picked me up had dropped me off in the middle of nowhere, promising me that someone else would come along soon. But as the hours ticked by and darkness fell, the road remained eerily empty. The only sounds were the chirping of crickets and the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. I was starting to consider camping out by the roadside when I saw headlights in the distance. Relief washed over me as the car slowed and pulled to a stop beside me. It was an old station wagon, the kind you don't see much anymore, with faded paint and a few dents in the fender. The driver rolled down the window, and I hesitated. Something about the man behind the wheel made my skin crawl. He was in his late 40s, with greasy hair slicked back and a crooked smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Need a ride?" he asked, his voice rough and gravelly. I almost said no. Every instinct screamed at me to turn him down, but I was alone, miles from the nearest town, and the thought of spending the night out here was even worse. Forcing a smile, I nodded and climbed into the passenger seat. The inside of the car smelled faintly of gasoline and something sour I couldn't place. The man didn't say much as we started down the highway, and I decided to keep it that way. I stared out the window, watching the trees blur past, counting the minutes until I could get out. "So," he said after a long silence, his voice cutting through the quiet like a blade. "Where you headed?" "The coast," I replied quickly, not wanting to encourage conversation. He nodded, his eyes fixed on the road. "Long way from here." I nodded, keeping my responses short. Something about the way he kept glancing at me out of the corner of his eye made my stomach churn. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, the knuckles white, and there was a strange tension in his posture, like he was holding something back. "You know," he said after another long pause, "you shouldn't be out here alone. Lot of bad things can happen to a girl out here." I forced a nervous laugh. "Yeah, I've heard that." He didn't laugh. Instead, he turned to me, his expression unreadable. "You ever hear about the ghost hitchhiker?" I blinked, caught off guard by the sudden change in topic. No. "What's that?" He smirked, a crooked grin that made my skin crawl. "They say there's a girl who haunts this road. She was killed hitchhiking years ago, and now she's stuck here, looking for someone to take her place." "That's creepy," I said, my voice shaky. He nodded, his eyes dark. "You know how it works? She gets picked up, rides along, and then disappears. But the driver, well, they don't make it. Their car ends up in a ditch, and their body's never found." I swallowed hard, my palms sweating. Sounds like an urban legend. "Maybe," he said, his smirk widening. "Or maybe not." The car grew silent again, but the air felt heavier, like it was pressing down on me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The road stretched endlessly ahead, lined by dense woods that seemed to close in the further we drove. "Hey," I said finally, trying to keep my voice steady. "You can drop me off at the next gas station. I'll figure the rest out from there." "There's no gas station for miles," he said, his tone flat. "I'll take you where you need to go." "No, really," I insisted, my pulse quickening. "I don't mind walking." His grip on the wheel tightened, and he didn't respond. My heart pounded as I glanced at the door, wondering if I could jump out without breaking a leg. And then I saw it. Just ahead, standing on the side of the road, was a figure. A girl dressed in what looked like an old-fashioned white dress, her hair hanging in dark, tangled strands around her face. She didn't move as we approached, just stood there staring at the car with hollow eyes. "Do you see her?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. The man didn't answer. His eyes were fixed on the road, his jaw clenched. As we passed the girl, I turned to look back, but she was gone, vanished as if she'd never been there. "Don't look back," the man said sharply, his voice cold. What was that?" I stammered. He didn't answer. Instead, he pressed harder on the gas, the car picking up speed as the trees blurred past. My chest tightened, and I gripped the seat, panic clawing at me. "Stop the car," I said, my voice shaking. "Let me out." He didn't respond. The car was flying down the highway now, the headlights cutting through the darkness like knives. I could barely breathe, my mind racing with thoughts of how to escape. And then, suddenly, the engine sputtered. The car slowed, jerking violently before coming to a complete stop in the middle of the road. The man cursed, slamming his hands on the wheel. "What's wrong?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Damn thing's dead," he muttered, opening the door and stepping out. "Stay here." I didn't want to stay. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to run, but my legs felt like lead. I watched as he walked to the front of the car, popping the hood and fiddling with something inside. And then I saw her again. The girl in the white dress standing just behind him, her face twisted into a grotesque grin. My breath caught in my throat as she reached out, her fingers brushing his shoulder. He froze, his body stiffening, and then he turned. The scream that followed was unlike anything I'd ever heard, raw, guttural, and filled with a terror I couldn't begin to comprehend. I didn't wait to see what happened next. Throwing the door open, I ran, my feet pounding against the asphalt as I fled into the night. I didn't stop until I reached the lights of a small diner on the edge of town, my lungs burning and my heart racing. When the police went to investigate, they found the car still on the road, the hood open and the engine cold. But the man was gone, and there was no sign of the girl in white. I never hitchhiked again after that. And even now, years later, I can't drive down an empty highway without looking over my shoulder, wondering if she's still out there, waiting for her next ride.
Story number 5.
It was the summer of 1998, and I was heading back to my hometown in the middle of the Appalachian Mountains. My car had broken down about a week earlier, and I didn't have the money to fix it, so I decided to hitchhike. I'd done it before and had never had an issue. Just stuck out my thumb, got picked up, and got to where I needed to go. Simple as that. This time, though, was different. I'd been walking along the highway for hours under a sky that was steadily darkening. The last town I'd passed was miles back, and there wasn't much traffic on the road. Just the occasional truck roaring by, its headlights cutting through the encroaching darkness. I was starting to think I might have to camp out in the woods when a beat-up pickup truck finally slowed and pulled over. The driver leaned out the window. A wiry man in his late 40s or early 50s with deep lines etched into his sun-weathered face and a cigarette dangling from his lips. "Need a ride?" he asked, his voice gravely. "Yeah," I said, relieved. "Just heading toward Ravenwood." "Hop in," he said, nodding toward the passenger seat. I hesitated for just a moment, something about the way he smiled making me uneasy, but my feet were sore, and the thought of walking all night was worse. I climbed in and set my backpack on the floor. The interior of the truck smelled like stale tobacco and something faintly metallic. There was a strange tension in the air, but I chalked it up to my own nerves. "Ravenwood, huh?" the man said as he pulled back onto the highway. "Not much out that way." "Yeah, just visiting family," I said, keeping my answers short. He nodded, taking a long drag from his cigarette. The glow of the ember briefly lit up his face, and I thought I saw something strange in his eyes. A flicker of something. We drove in silence for a while, the only sound the low rumble of the engine and the occasional hum of insects from outside. I stared out the window, trying to shake off the growing unease in my chest. "You ever hear about the devil's hitchhiker?" the man asked suddenly, breaking the silence. I turned to look at him, caught off guard. "The what?" he smirked, the corners of his mouth twitching like he was holding back a laugh. "They say there's a hitchhiker out here who ain't human. Looks like a regular person, but if you pick 'em up, you're done for. They'll ride with you for a while, maybe even make small talk, but eventually they turn on you. And when they do..." He made a slashing motion across his throat, his grin widening. "That's comforting," I said, forcing a nervous laugh. The man shrugged. "Just a story, I guess. But you hear a lot of strange things out here in the mountains. People go missing all the time, and sometimes all they find is the car. No sign of the driver." I shifted in my seat, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. "Why are you telling me this?" He shrugged again, his grin fading. "Figured you'd want to know. Never know who you're getting in a car with, right?" I didn't respond, my heart pounding. The air in the truck felt heavier, the smell of tobacco and metal growing stronger. "You ever hear screams out here?" he asked suddenly, his voice low. "Screams?" I echoed, my throat dry. "Yeah," he said, his eyes fixed on the road. "Sometimes when I drive this stretch of highway at night, I hear 'em, like people screaming in the woods. But when I stop and listen, there's nothing there." I stared at him, my pulse racing. "That's weird." He nodded, his expression serious. "Weird, yeah, but it's real. I've heard it plenty of times." The road stretched on, the trees on either side casting long shadows in the fading light. The man didn't say anything else for a while, and I started to think maybe I was overreacting, that he was just a weird guy with a dark sense of humor. Then he took a sudden turn onto a dirt road that cut through the woods. This isn't the highway," I said, gripping the edge of my seat. "Shortcut," he said, not looking at me. "Look, I'd really rather stay on the main road," I said, my voice shaking. He didn't respond, his hands tightening on the steering wheel. The truck bounced along the uneven road, the trees pressing in closer, their branches clawing at the windows. I glanced at the door, considering jumping out, but the truck was moving too fast, and the woods looked thick and unforgiving. "What are you doing?" I demanded, panic rising in my chest. The man didn't answer. His eyes were fixed on the road ahead, his jaw clenched. "Stop the truck!" I shouted. He slammed on the brakes, the truck skidding to a stop in the middle of the dirt road. Before I could open the door, he turned to me, his eyes wild and bloodshot. "Get out," he growled. "What? Get out," he said, his voice trembling. I didn't argue. I grabbed my backpack and stumbled out of the truck, my legs shaky. The man leaned out the window, his face pale and drenched in sweat. "Don't go back to the highway," he said. "Not tonight. Stay in the woods if you have to, but don't go back." With that, he gunned the engine and sped off, leaving me standing there in the dark, the sound of the truck fading into the distance. I stood there for a moment, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Then, slowly, I started walking back toward the highway. I hadn't gone far when I heard it, the faint sound of footsteps crunching on the gravel behind me. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. "Hello?" I called, my voice barely above a whisper. No response. I quickened my pace, glancing over my shoulder every few steps. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until they were almost right behind me. I turned, my flashlight sweeping the road, but there was no one there. The woods around me were silent, the kind of silence that presses against your ears and makes your skin crawl. And then I heard it, a low guttural growl coming from the trees. I bolted, running as fast as I could toward the highway, the sound of something crashing through the underbrush behind me. When I finally burst out onto the asphalt, I didn't stop. I kept running, my lungs burning, until I saw the lights of a truck coming toward me. I waved my arms frantically, and the truck slowed to a stop. The driver, an older man with kind eyes, leaned out the window. "You okay, kid?" he asked. "Please," I gasped. "Just get me out of here." He didn't ask any questions, just nodded and opened the passenger door. As we drove away, I glanced back at the woods, half expecting to see something watching me from the shadows. I never hitchhiked again after that night, and to this day, I don't know what I heard out there in the woods, but I'll never forget the way the man in the pickup looked at me, his fear as real as my own. And sometimes when I'm alone at night, I still hear those footsteps.
Story number 6.
I used to work late shifts at a diner just off a long, lonely stretch of highway in rural Texas. It was one of those places that stayed open 24/7, catering to truckers, night owls, and the occasional drifter. The kind of place where the coffee was always burnt, and the jukebox in the corner played the same 5 songs on a loop. One night during the graveyard shift, I had only one customer, a guy sitting in the farthest booth, nursing a black coffee. He was tall and lanky, with a weathered face and sunken eyes. He hadn't said much, just nodded when I refilled his cup. He gave off a vibe I couldn't quite place, like he was on edge but trying to hide it. Around 2 a.m., the bell above the door jingled, and a woman walked in. She was young, maybe mid-20s, with long dark hair and a pale, almost ghostly complexion. Her clothes looked outdated, like something out of the 1960s, but they were clean and pressed. She smiled at me, though it didn't reach her eyes. "Is it okay if I sit anywhere?" she asked softly. "Sure," I said, gesturing to the empty booths. She chose the one closest to the door and sat down, her hands folded neatly on the table. I brought her a menu, and she thanked me with that same hollow smile. "Coffee, please," she said after a moment. "Black." I nodded and went to get her coffee, glancing over at the man in the back booth as I did. He was staring at her, his face pale and rigid, his hands gripping his mug so tightly I thought it might shatter. When I brought the coffee back to the woman, she tilted her head slightly and looked up at me. "Have you worked here long?" "Couple of years," I said, setting the cup down in front of her. "Not much changes around here." She nodded, her gaze distant. "You ever see anything strange?" The question caught me off guard. "Strange? Like what?" "People," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "People who don't belong." I glanced over at the man in the back booth. He was still staring at her, his face etched with something between fear and recognition. I turned back to her, forcing a smile. "We get all kinds passing through." She nodded again, her eyes drifting to the window. The highway stretched out beyond the diner, empty and bathed in the cold glow of the fluorescent lights outside. "It's a dangerous road," she said softly. "So many people disappear." I didn't know how to respond to that, so I just gave her a polite nod and walked back to the counter. The man in the back booth called me over as soon as I set down the coffee pot. "Who is she?" he hissed, his voice low and urgent. "What do you mean?" I asked, glancing toward the woman. She was still staring out the window, her hands wrapped around her coffee cup. "I've seen her before," he said, his eyes darting nervously between me and her. "On this road. She's not normal." I frowned. "What are you talking about?" He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I'm a trucker. Been driving this highway for years. A few months ago, I picked her up. She was hitchhiking right around mile marker 81. My stomach tightened. And she wasn't there when I stopped to drop her off," he said, his voice trembling. "One second, she was in the passenger seat, and the next, she was gone. Just vanished." I stared at him, unsure whether he was messing with me or if he truly believed what he was saying. "Maybe she got out when you weren't looking." He shook his head vehemently. "No, the doors never opened. She just disappeared. And now she's here." I glanced back at the woman. She was looking at us now, her head tilted slightly, a faint smile playing on her lips. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. "Maybe you're mistaken," I said, though I didn't believe it. "I'm not," he said, his voice cracking. "I swear that's her." I wanted to tell him to calm down, that he was being ridiculous, but something about his fear felt genuine. And then the woman stood up. Her movement was fluid, almost too smooth, as she walked toward the counter. The man shrank back into his booth, his hands trembling. "Thank you for the coffee," she said, placing a few neatly folded bills on the counter. "I should be going." "Do you need a ride?" I asked, my voice barely steady. She shook her head. "No, thank you. I'll be fine." And with that, she walked out of the diner, the bell above the door jingling softly as it closed behind her. I watched her through the window as she stepped onto the highway, her figure illuminated briefly by the fluorescent lights before she disappeared into the darkness. The man bolted from his booth, nearly knocking over his coffee in his haste. "I'm leaving," he said, throwing a crumpled bill on the table. "Lock the doors. Don't let anyone else in." "Wait," I said, my heart racing. "What's going on?" But he didn't answer. He just shoved open the door and ran to his truck, his tires screeching as he sped off down the highway. I stood there, frozen, my mind racing. The diner was eerily quiet now, the hum of the lights the only sound. I walked over to the window, my breath fogging the glass as I peered out into the darkness. The highway was empty, stretching out like a black ribbon under the starless sky. And then I saw her. She was standing by the side of the road just beyond the glow of the diner's lights. Her face was turned toward the diner, her features obscured by the shadows. But I could feel her eyes on me, piercing and cold. I stumbled back, my heart pounding. When I looked again, she was gone. I locked the doors after that, my hands shaking as I turned the deadbolt. The rest of the night passed in a blur of unease and paranoia, every creak and shadow sending my nerves into overdrive. I told myself it was just a coincidence, that the trucker was paranoid and the woman was just a traveler passing through, but deep down I knew better. The next morning, when my shift ended, I drove down the highway toward home. As I passed mile marker 81, I slowed down, glancing at the side of the road. There she was, standing in the exact same spot, her pale face turned toward me, her eyes unblinking. I didn't stop. I didn't even look back. But I could feel her presence, like a weight pressing down on me, long after she disappeared from my rearview mirror. I don't work the late shift anymore, and I don't drive that stretch of highway if I can avoid it. But sometimes, late at night, I dream of her standing by the side of the road, her hollow smile etched into my mind, and I wake up with the unshakable feeling that she's still out there, waiting.
Story number 7.
Back in the early 2000s, I worked as a night security guard at an industrial park just outside of Portland. It wasn't exactly the most thrilling job, but it paid the bills. My main task was to patrol the sprawling property in my beat-up Ford Escort, making sure no one was trespassing or breaking into the warehouses. The industrial park was isolated, surrounded by dense woods that seemed to swallow any sound other than the occasional rustling of leaves or distant hoot of an owl. It was usually dead quiet at night, which made my job both easy and eerie. One night, I was about halfway through my shift. I'd already driven the perimeter twice, checked all the building doors, and radioed in to let dispatch know everything was fine. I decided to park in one of the lots near the edge of the woods and take a break. I leaned back in my seat, sipping lukewarm coffee from my thermos, when I noticed something odd. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement in the trees. Just a shadow at first, but it was enough to catch my attention. I turned my headlights toward the woods, squinting into the darkness, but all I saw were the skeletal branches swaying gently in the breeze. I told myself it was probably just a deer or a raccoon, and went back to my coffee. About 10 minutes later, I heard it, a low, guttural growl coming from the woods. It didn't sound like any animal I'd ever heard, and I'd grown up in the area, familiar with the local wildlife. This was different, deep, almost human. I rolled down my window a crack, straining to hear. The growl came again, louder this time, and it sent a shiver down my spine. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out of the car, scanning the tree line. "Hello?" I called, my voice shaky. "Anyone out there?" No response, just the wind and the creak of the trees. I took a few hesitant steps toward the woods, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The beam landed on something about 20 feet away, a figure standing just inside the tree line. At first I thought it was a person, but something was off. They were too tall, their limbs too long and thin, like they'd been stretched unnaturally. Their face was obscured by shadows, but I could feel their eyes on me, unblinking and cold. "Hey!" I shouted, more out of fear than authority. "This is private property. You need to leave." The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching me. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely hear anything else. I started backing toward my car, never taking my eyes off the thing in the trees. That's when it moved. It didn't walk. It didn't run. It shifted like it was gliding through the air, covering 10 feet in the blink of an eye. My flashlight beam wavered as my hands shook, but the figure stopped just at the edge of the light, its face still hidden. I scrambled back to my car, fumbling for the door handle. I jumped in, locked the doors, and turned the engine on. My headlights flooded the woods, but the figure was gone. I didn't stick around to investigate. I drove to the main office, parked under the floodlights, and radioed dispatch. I told them I'd seen someone on the property, but I left out the details. What was I supposed to say? That a shadowy, inhuman figure had been stalking me in the woods? When the sun rose, I did one last patrol before my shift ended. Everything looked normal. No footprints, no signs of trespassing. I almost convinced myself it had been my imagination, fueled by too much caffeine and too little sleep. Almost. A few nights later, I was back on duty. I avoided parking near the woods, sticking to the well-lit areas closer to the warehouses. The night was uneventful until around 3 a.m., when I was making my rounds near one of the larger buildings. As I turned the corner, my headlights caught something that made my blood run cold. Written on the side of the warehouse, in what looked like smeared mud, or maybe something worse, were the words, "I see you." I slammed on the brakes, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out of the car, my legs trembling. The message was fresh, the mud or substance still wet and dripping. I scanned the area with my flashlight, but the lot was empty. The only sound was the hum of the building's ventilation system. I didn't know what to do. Call the police? My boss? What could I even tell them? That someone, or something, was toying with me? I decided to finish my shift and report it in the morning. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, though. Every time I looked over my shoulder, I half expected to see that figure standing there just beyond the reach of the light. The next night, I came prepared. I brought a camera, hoping to catch evidence of whatever or whoever was messing with me. I also carried a crowbar, not that I thought it would do much good if I encountered that thing again. Around 2 a.m., I parked near one of the smaller warehouses and started my patrol on foot. I wanted to prove to myself that I wasn't afraid, that I could handle this. But as I approached the edge of the woods, I felt it again, that suffocating sense of being watched. I stopped and scanned the area with my flashlight. My breath caught in my throat when I saw it. The figure, standing farther back in the trees this time, but unmistakable. It was watching me, its head tilted slightly, almost as if it were curious. I raised my camera, snapping several photos with shaking hands. The flash lit up the woods, and for a split second I saw its face. Pale, hollow, with empty black eyes and a mouth that stretched too wide, like it was trying to smile but didn't quite know how. I didn't wait to see if it would move closer. I turned and ran back to my car, my heart pounding. I locked the doors, started the engine, and sped back to the main office. When I finally calmed down enough to check the camera, my stomach dropped. The photos were all blank. Every single one. I quit the job a week later. I told my boss it was for personal reasons. But the truth was, I couldn't take it anymore. Whatever was out there wasn't going to leave me alone, and I wasn't about to stick around and find out what it wanted. To this day, I don't know what I saw in those woods. A spirit? A creature? My imagination running wild? All I know is I've never felt fear like that before, or since. And whenever I drive past that industrial park, I keep my eyes firmly on the road, never looking toward the trees, because deep down I know it's still there, watching, waiting.